Would you pray with me? Prepare our hearts, O God, to accept your word. Silence in us any voices but your own, so that we may hear your word and also do it. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Hear now a reading from the Gospel of Mark, the 8th chapter, verses 27 to 37. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began rebuking him. But turning and looking at the disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life?" This is the word of the Lord. Have you ever been so excited about an event or a milestone that you imagine about it and dream about it for weeks before it comes? Maybe you imagined your wedding for years and years, and therefore you can hardly sleep because of all the excitement you know is coming the next day. Or perhaps you imagined a graduation day as one beaming with joy and pride all around. Or what about a big move? As you said goodbye to all that was familiar, with great hope, you opened yourself to new places and new people. Or maybe you've imagined again and again what it would be like to reconnect with an old friend. You meet up, make a bit of small talk, finally say the hard things that need to be said, acknowledging the past, saying sorry, and then you spend the rest of the evening catching up on years gone by. All of this expectation and planning can carry us on the wings of life's possibility. Life can be so rich and beautiful that we soar with expectation. But sometimes, when we soar on the wings of expectation, it can carry us into its own world, where at times it diverges from reality. The movie 500 Days of Summer has a great scene that illustrates this reality and expectations thing. The main character, Tom, goes to a party in hopes of winning back his ex-girlfriend, Summer. The scene is set up with 2 films playing side by side. One side of the screen has the word expectations written on the bottom, and the other side of the screen has the word reality. You can imagine what comes next. As Tom walks up to Summer's door, birthday gift in hand, both films are the same, they're identical. But as soon as Summer opens the door, the 2 scenes diverge. The expectation side shows Tom meeting Summer, them catching up and spending the evening in a quiet corner. The reality side shows Tom standing alone for most of the party, making small talk with strangers. You can imagine how heart-wrenching it is to watch the two scenes play out side by side as anticipation is met with disappointment. Now, in our story from the Gospel of Mark today, Peter is having the similar expectations versus reality side-by-side situation. And because the Gospel of Mark is incredibly cinematic, each scene kind of cuts into the next with immediately, and all of a sudden the Gospel is over, it seems fitting to retell the story through these dual films of Peter's expectations and reality. So imagine with me, expectations on this side, reality on this side. Both screens are identical as Jesus and his disciples set out walking. They're walking away from the Jewish crowds that had swarmed them, and they're walking toward a Roman village with temples to Caesar and altars to other gods. And on the way, in this in-between space, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" The disciples have been among the crowds, hearing various people trying to make sense of who this Jesus guy really is. So surely they know some of the gossip. And they do. The disciples report what they have heard. First, someone says, "Herod himself thinks that you are John the Baptist, come back to life to haunt him." Another adds, "The people aren't all the same, though. Others think you're Elijah. They think you're here to announce that the day will soon be here where God will judge between those who fear God and those who don't." As they walk, a third quickly adds, "Still others say you're a prophet in the line of Moses. Your signs show that you speak for the Lord." Notice that all three of these descriptions liken Jesus to someone else who has already come before. But the question that comes next is one that echoes through millennia to each one of us. But who do you say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Peter responds with, "You are the Messiah." The Greek word is Christos, Christ, meaning literally anointed one, the long-awaited Christ. I've always imagined the brisk walking disciples and the swift storytelling of Mark stopping dead right there. You are the Messiah. This is the first time anyone has used that word to describe Jesus in the whole Gospel of Mark. We hear that word all the time, Christ. Whenever we say our religion, Christians, people who are trying to follow Christ. We practically use Christ as Jesus' last name. But what Messiah really means is where the expectations side of the screen and the reality side begin to diverge. From his confession that Jesus is the Messiah, Peter's expectations take flight. And all the historical and biblical evidence I can gather leads me to think Peter's expectations looked something like this. Jesus responds, "Yes, Peter, I am the anointed one in the line of David. I am the culmination of all that the Jewish people have hoped for years. I am king over the Jews and thus over and against the Romans. The time has come for me to reign. Go out and tell everyone that I am the long-expected Christ. Instruct them to grab their weapons. Meet us back here. It is time to violently overthrow those Romans. We're going to restore Israel's independence, free the Jewish people, and be righteous before God." From this little road, a revolt would gain momentum. Jesus would lead the battle to a victorious end reminiscent of the days of Joshua, where God overcame great odds for the sake of the Israelite people. All the miracles Jesus had done up to this point were simply preparation for this big victory miracle. For Peter, not only would he be a key part in this new independence, but he and his people would finally live in relative peace. No more Roman taxation leaving them poor. No more Roman governors imposing their law on top of the Jewish law. No more Roman soldiers calling the Jewish people backwards and stupid. No, the Jewish people would finally have security. They would be safe from outside threats. They would have the power to govern themselves and determine their future. And best of all, their status as a people and as individuals would be solidified in the history books. Now, I'm not a biblical author, and there's a reason for that, but you get the picture. For Peter, Jesus being the Messiah would mean independence, security, and power. Now hold these hopes and expectations in your heart as we watch the reality film. Jesus instructs his disciples to tell no one. Tell no one that he is the anointed king. He will maintain this insistence on silence even past the transfiguration, where Moses and Elijah themselves show up to talk with Jesus. Then, perhaps while Jesus begins walking again, he tells the disciples that instead of leading a victorious revolt, he must undergo great suffering. Instead of bringing all of the Jewish people together, he will be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, basically all of the religious and political leaders of the time. And then his messiahship will culminate in death, and he will be raised again 3 days later. The Messiah must suffer, accept rejection, and die. What a letdown. What a letdown for Peter. I think Peter was so enthralled in his own expectations about the Messiah that he avoids what Jesus has said altogether. Instead, he takes Jesus aside and begins rebuking him, just like Jesus would rebuke a demon in an exorcism. Peter would rather believe that Jesus has a demon and needs exorcism than to believe what he has just said. And while exorcism is a bit extreme, who wouldn't resist suffering, rejection, and death? I know I would. What about you? The fact that resistance to pain and death is near universal, at least in our culture, makes Jesus' next words a bit odd to me. Get behind me, Satan. First of all, Satan comes from the Hebrew word Satan, which means actually just accuser. In the book of Job, Ha-Satan, the Satan, is present in God's heavenly court. So instead of being some supreme overlord of evil, Satan's more like an adversarial questioner or a prosecutor. Sorry, prosecutors, you do great work, but that's the origin of the word, at least in the Old Testament. And then by the time we get to Mark, the concept of Satan has shifted from questioner to chief distractor. Some say the Gospel of Mark is one almost uninterrupted temptation narrative. Early in the Gospel, Satan tempts Jesus with security, status, and power. And now Jesus predicts his future will contain the exact opposite: of those things. Instead of security, suffering. Instead of high status, rejection. Instead of power, death. Peter is trying to pull Jesus off course, and suddenly he himself becomes chief distractor and tempter. Hence, Jesus resisting the temptation to go back on it all and telling Peter to get behind him. Jesus is not only disappointing Peter's expectations here, though, but now he is turning them completely on their heads. In fact, the entire Gospel of Mark turns upside down at this point. The story comes in chapter 8 of 16, almost exactly halfway through the Gospel. And up until now, Jesus' ministry has been one of miracles, exorcisms, healings, feeding the multitudes, all events that fit pretty well into the story of Peter's expectations for a powerful Messiah king. But from here on out, the long-awaited Messiah Jesus will be moving toward his death. After this story, Jesus only does 2 more miracles compared to so many before. Instead, he will constantly walk towards Jerusalem, where he knows he will die. His fame will only be in the form of the suffering servant, his strength only in the weakness of his spirit leaving his body. His kingship will not mean power over other nations, and his coronation will be the cross. And yet, 2 words that are such a gift in our Christian vocabulary, and yet it is by Jesus' humiliation that he humiliates those who ruthlessly seek power. And yet, by his servanthood, Jesus raises up the lowly. By his death and resurrection, Jesus kills death. That is why we can sing, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" Jesus is indeed the Messiah Christ. But he is the Christ who overturns human expectation and instead reveals the true fabric of reality. And we, as those called by that name of Christ, are invited to live not according to the expectations of the world, but according to the reality of God that we see through Christ. As Christ followers, that reality is one where we remember our mortality and entrust our lives to God. That is one where acute awareness of suffering leads to compassion and action, where we lay down our ego and our pride to look someone in the eye and finally offer that long-awaited apology. Because as Christ followers, we too value people more highly than status, security, or power. Taking up our crosses, then, doesn't mean accepting mistreatment or oppression. It doesn't mean quiet suffering submission to the powers that be, whether they be intimate or distant. But instead, it means participation in the victory of Christ over the powers of death. It means taking Christ's account of reality more seriously than Caesar's or Peter's, or maybe in some ways our own. Because ultimately, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are evidence of God's remarkable determination not to leave us to our own devices or our own expectations. and thanks be to God.